Thanks, Lance. It's time now to round up. A historic ruling by the nation's high court legalizing same-sex marriage across the nation is drawing different reactions. In a sweeping 5-4 opinion authored by Justice Anthony Kennedy, the Supreme Court declared same-sex marriage the law of the land, finding a fundamental constitutional right for same-sex couples to marry in all 50 states. The decision puts an end to same-sex marriage bans in 14 states, including Texas. 4 of the court's 9 justices dissented, accusing their colleagues of taking power away that belongs to the states and to voters. The same-sex marriage ruling is our topic this half hour, and we want to hear from you on Facebook and on Twitter, so make sure you post your comments using the hashtag Fox26forlife. Joining us live in the newsroom is Fox 26 senior legal analyst Chris Tritico, Fox 26 news analyst Mustafa Tamiz, and public policy analyst Jackie Bally. Good morning, you guys.
Good morning. Morning.
Can't wait to hear this debate.
Well, look, let's start out with a little bit of history. This is a historic ruling by the U.S. Supreme Court, finding that there is a constitutional, a fundamental right for gay people to marry, same-sex couples to marry. But let me give you a little history lesson, because this is not the first time the United States Supreme Court has weighed in on marriage, and not the first time they found a fundamental right to marry. In 1967, in Loving versus Virginia, the U.S. Supreme Court said, in upholding the constitutionality of these provisions in the decision below, oh, that's not the, golly, hang on, I had it, this thing keeps moving on me. Marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, fundamental to our very existence and survival. To deny this fundamental freedom is so unsupportable on the basis of racial classifications embodied in these statutes is wrong, and they found for the first time a 14th Amendment fundamental right to marry, striking down, Jackie Bally, 17 states' laws that said mixed race couples cannot marry. In saying to the states, you cannot regulate marriage in that fashion. I wonder how many people think that decision from 1967 is judicial activism.
Well, first of all, we saw this trend coming. We've discussed it on the show, so I don't think anyone was really surprised by this ruling. However, I do agree with Roberts when he says that it should be a states' rights issue, because and I'm very much a proponent of policies like this, not just this one, but policies like this should be determined at the state level, because what is applicable for Washington is not applicable for Texas. We are just different here. But with all of that said, we saw this coming. I don't think people put the two together, because first of all, people will say you have the right of being a human being, versus saying a right of who you choose to marry is different than having the right of being an actual body, an actual human person. So a lot of people try to bring the two together, but there's a strong base that says the two should not be together. With all of that said, I think your joke is hilarious that gays should have the punishment of being married just like the rest of us, right?
Let be as unhappy as the rest of us?
Yeah.
That's not my original joke, by the way.
Oh, okay, sorry. I messed it up. I don't want your wife to get mad.
I borrowed that from somebody. No, I just borrowed that from somebody else. But, you know, the point that I'm trying to make is, in 1967, the court said the states cannot regulate a marriage in such a fashion to prevent an African American from marrying a white person. Isn't that the same thing they're saying here? The state can't regulate this?
Yeah. The courts have always led on civil rights issues. The civil rights issues don't move forward just because of popular opinion. They move forward in courts. That's been the history of our country, starting, you know, with the women's movement, with the suffrage movement, with civil rights for African Americans and Latinos. So courts have always played an important role. What's happened now, for the first time, I think, that the courts have actually not just moved the debate, but they've also moved with the popular public opinion. And so if the court case that you're citing, back then, that was a very unpopular decision that the court made. The distinction is, now that the court has made a decision on gay marriage, that seems to be a popular decision.
But what's wrong with Jackie's argument and a lot of Republicans' arguments? This is really something the states should be able to regulate on their own. What's wrong with that?
Well, because we live in the United States of America, and if you got married in Texas, you do travel to California. If your job moves you, then what happens? You're unmarried automatically? There are some issues that are federal issues, and states have rights. But when it comes to basic basic things, right? Interstate transportation. How can you build an interstate highway if you don't deal with other states? How can you do marriage when two people maybe even live in different states? So there has to be federal policy that covers it.
And isn't that really the end result here, that the full faith and credit clause of the Constitution has to win out here and say we can't have a hodgepodge of this where you can be married in one state and not married in another?
Well, first of all, I don't believe that having government overreach and having government interference in your lives is something that we should encourage. So no, I don't agree with that. I think that each state has their own regulations and rules, and we should not honor, but we should respect what each state does in their own state. But those policies, I think that the constituents in that state should determine, with the leadership in that state, should determine what governs them.
If that argument were true, then cases like Loving versus Virginia would never have been passed by the U.S. Supreme Court, and it would still be unlawful for a black to marry a white.
But that's not correct, because you're seeing the trend. Some things that we've discussed, like marijuana in Texas, you're seeing the trend that as popular belief, as your constituency changes, you see the laws in that particular state change. In Texas in particular, we're just very conservative, much more so than our northern counterparts. So certain laws that we have in place, they don't have in place, or vice versa. But as your constituents change, you will see changes in your laws.
Let's talk about the religious aspect of this. What happens, nobody yet has said, the Supreme Court has not said the Catholic Church has to marry same-sex couples. What happens when somebody files suit over that and says, wait a minute, I now have the fundamental right to marry, you have to marry me, church?
I think the Supreme Court will step in and on the side of religious organizations and say that can't happen, right? I mean, in essence, there is movement in some churches to include.
Well, that's a church by church basis.
Exactly, and so I think the separation of church and state. And I think look, I don't think that's going to be a problem. I think the real issue is that how do you get rid of bigotry and racism and sexism and gender issues, and that has to be a public conversation. I don't think that there's going to be a movement to try to push the Catholic Church.
Let me go to Domily. She's monitoring our social media.
Yeah, Arnetta Murray, I tried to pop it up on the big screen but couldn't. She says, same-sex ruling, not surprised about it. I personally don't agree with it, but it's the law and I will respect the law. Now, Tony McElroy also made a comment on Twitter. He says, why is government involved in marriage anyway? Texas should stop issuing licenses and let people get married through churches. What's your opinion on that, guys?
Well, I mean, the law is clear that the state has a right to regulate marriage in certain circumstances, in certain fashions, and having a marriage license is one of those things that the state has the right to do. And the state of Texas, nor any other state, is ever going to give up that ability, because then you have the chance to and the ability to stop cousins from marrying cousins and all kinds of things. And so they're not going to do that. I want to get back to this religious talk for just a minute. I also want to get you to opine on what happens now with private businesses. We've talked about this in the last couple of years, where in Arizona someone didn't want to make a cake for a same-sex couple. Is the civil rights argument here going to move into private business?
Yes, I think it is, based on the ruling that we just saw. I think you're going to have a lot of private business owners who are going to have a problem with this. You're going to have a lot of people who feel that their religious freedoms are being infringed upon. In the African American community, you will see a strong and large number who are since the ruling, I've heard from a lot of African Americans, and you're going to see them say that, this goes against their basic religious principles. And so you're going to continue to see people push back on this. The last poll that was taken on this, 40% of the general population, regardless of where you are politically, disagree with this ruling. So you're going to see a pushback, but I think based on the ruling, you're going to continue to see the Supreme Court go in this direction.
We're almost out of time, but going into this decision coming out, 60% of the country was in favor of gay marriage.
Yeah, 60%, 6 out of 10 people were in favor of it. But the other part is that this doesn't protect you from bigotry, and that's why you have the Equal Rights Ordinance in Houston, and that's why that ordinance is important as well.